10 years ago, last month, the terrorist attacks of September 11th shook the United States to its core. Tonight, we will take a look back at the last decade and what it's been like for teens to grow up in the aftermath of the attacks.
We will be joined by experts to examine how our culture and politics has changed with the last 10 years of war, and we will hear from teens about their personal experiences in the post-9/11 world. It's October 3rd, 2011, and Student News starts right now. Good evening. I'm Joshua Wolfson. And before we jump right into this topic, it is my pleasure to introduce my new Student News co-anchor, the one and only Giovanna Robinson-Heides. Take it away.
Thanks, Josh. It's good to be here. At 8:14 a.m. on September 11th, 2001, American Airlines Flight 11 out of the Boston's Logan Airport, heading for Los Angeles, is hijacked by 5 extreme Islamic terrorists from the organization of Al-Qaeda. At 8:46 a.m., approximately 32 minutes later, the hijackers crashed Flight 11 into floors 93 through 99 of the World Trade Center's North Tower in New York City, carrying out the first of 3 successful terrorist attacks that day. The aftermath of those attacks 10 years ago and how that aftermath has affected those young people growing up in this past decade is the subject of tonight's episode of Student News. However, before we can examine the attack's effects, we need to look back at everything that has happened surrounding September 11th, both before and after the attacks.
Al-Qaeda, the terrorist organization which orchestrated the attacks of September 11th, was operating most extensively in the country of Afghanistan, located in the Middle East. The Middle Eastern region has seen instability and violence on and off ever since the First World War, the conflict from which today's Middle Eastern boundaries originated. As reported on NPR's All Things Considered, the Middle Eastern nations prior to World War I were not, in fact, nations at all, but were rather one part of the vast United Ottoman Empire. During the war, however, the British and French governments sent in agents to foment revolution, and by the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, the countries of Europe divided the Middle Eastern lands and peoples amongst themselves, as this map shows. New York University professor of Middle Eastern history, Zachary Lockman, told NPR, quote, "Everyone understood at the time that this was a thinly disguised new form of colonialism. The British and French, even though they were charged under the mandate system with leading these countries toward eventual self-rule, toward eventual independence, the British and French had no thought of going anywhere anytime soon, and fully intended to remain in control of these territories for the indefinite future." Local resistance to this European dominance soon led to violent clashes, and it was in those years that some of the ideological underpinnings of Islamic extremist groups were born. Between 1920 and the end of the Second World War, the Middle Eastern nations moved more closely to independence. Now, this background is not to say that the Western imperialism exhibited after the First World War is the only reason for Middle East instability. Far from it. In the years following World War II, there have been numerous conflicts, and the creation of the State of Israel also created a vast amount of instability in the Middle East. Post-World War I imperialism, however, is certainly a determining factor in the development of the modern Middle East.
The September 11th attacks were planned by terrorists and Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden, who was killed by the U.S. Navy SEALs at his hideout in Pakistan on May 1st of this year. Osama bin Laden's father, Mohammed bin Laden, made an enormous fortune in Saudi Arabia in construction, building palaces for the royal family, and then renovating holy sites. In 1958, Osama bin Laden was born, his father's 7th son and the 17th child. In 1967, when Osama bin Laden was 10 years old, his father died in a plane crash. The New York Times reports that bin Laden, along with his other siblings, inherited millions of dollars. The Times noted that bin Laden grew up, quote, playing with Saudi princes and had his own stable of horses by age 15. The New York Times noted in bin Laden's obituary, quote, bin Laden had been educated and indeed steeped, as many Saudi children are, in Wahhabism, is a puritanical, ardently anti-Western strain of Islam. Even years later, he so despised the Saudi ruling family's coziness with Western nations that he refused to refer Saudi Arabia by its modern name, instead calling it the country of two holy places. Bin Laden started to gain power as a militant in the early 1980s when he moved near the Pakistan-Afghani border while the Soviet Union occupied Afghanistan. Over the course of the next decade, Bin Laden would support, encourage, train, and keep track of young jihadists to fight the Soviet occupation. It was during this time that Bin Laden founded al-Qaeda. The United States government, the height of the Cold War, also supported the resistance to the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. Although the U.S. government never dealt with Bin Laden directly, the United States supported him and the resistance with funding and arms through the Pakistani intelligence service. Bin Laden said those years, quote, "There I received volunteers who came from the Saudi kingdom and from all over the Arab and Muslim countries. I set up my first camp where these volunteers were trained by Pakistani and American officers. The weapons were supplied by the Americans, the money by the Saudis." After the fall of the Soviet Union, Bin Laden turned his sights on the United States. In 1993, 6 people were killed when a truck exploded beneath the World Trade Center. It was a suicide bombing, and Bin Laden praised the man who carried out the attack. In 1998, Bin Laden issued an etiquette declaring that it was an individual duty for Muslims to attack Americans everywhere in the world. In 1999, the United States declared al-Qaeda an international terrorist organization.
On Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, at 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 collided with the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Excuse me. At 9:03 a.m., American Airlines Flight 175 crashed into the South Tower. At 9:37 a.m., hijackers crashed American Airlines Flight 77 into the west side of the Pentagon, the U.S. Defense Department's headquarters. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower at the World Trade Center collapsed, followed by the North Tower at 10:28 a.m. The final plane, American Airlines Flight 93, was hijacked but never reached its target because after Flight 93's passengers learned the plane had been hijacked, they collectively voted to try to retake the plane. To prevent the passengers from retaking the plane, the hijackers crashed Flight 93 into a field in Pennsylvania, killing everyone on board. In the aftermath of the terrorist attacks, which took the lives of approximately 3,000 Americans, the United States invaded Afghanistan on October 7, 2001, with the goal of destroying al-Qaeda and removing from power the Taliban, the group that had harbored al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. U.S. and NATO allied forces took down the Taliban regime and founded the democratic government in Afghanistan, led by President Hamid Karzai. In 2003, Taliban forces began an insurgency campaign in Afghanistan, which U.S. forces have been fighting ever since. In 2003, U.S. President George W. Bush moved to invade Iraq on the grounds that Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, or nuclear weapons. U.S. troops invaded Iraq on March 20th, and the government fell within 3 weeks. Resistance to U.S. forces and the new government in Iraq has led to many casualties and the creation of an al-Qaeda branch in Iraq where there never was one before. In 4 days, the Afghanistan war will turn 10 years old. The Iraq war will have lasted 9 years as of this coming March. As of August, 1,626 U.S. troops had died in Afghanistan, and 4,474 had died in Iraq. According to Defense Department figures, the United States spends $9.7 billion a month on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And according to a Brown University research project, the United States has spent a minimum of $3.7 trillion in total on the two wars. Now, over the last 10 years at home, security measures have been drastically increased everywhere. Some argue to the detriment of civil liberties. New government agencies have been created, and MSNBC estimates that there are enough new buildings in the country devoted to fighting terror that they could fill an area the size of Washington, D.C.
In light of the decades' changes with regards to terrorism and security, what has it been like for teens to grow up in this country? And how have our experiences differed from those of previous generations' teens? Student news reporters Graham Churchill and Laura Nunnally sat down with teens and adults to take a look at these questions. Take a look.
Well, in past national conflicts, we had a draft. And so every family felt threatened by the war because their son or sons might be, their number might be called up and they might be sent off to fight. So I think it was in some ways harder to get into wars because there was a danger that your own kid might have to go fight. And now it's in a way it's easier to say, oh yeah, let's get in another war, because there's those volunteer kids that they'll go off and fight, and it doesn't affect my family that much. So that's a big difference.
Well, I'd say the biggest way the wars have affected my life is I've had several cousins go to Afghanistan and Iraq, and I think they both did 4-year tours of duty in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And so that was probably the biggest way it affected my life, because we get letters from them and they tell us what's going on. And I was older at that point, so it was kind of, some of the letters were kind of disturbing, because the way they talk about the people that are there really doesn't, it makes them seem inhuman a little bit, just because I think they're scared of the people that are there. The people that are there are scared of them. And so they kind of see each other almost as enemies in a way. That's just the message I kind of got from a lot of their letters.
To tell you the truth, it sort of scares me how little an impact the war has on my day-to-day life. Because on the one hand, I know that the country is at war, but the fact that it's not a home, it's not being fought at home, just makes it so, I feel so distant from it. And there are, periods of time where I completely forget about it. And that scares me, because people are dying. And when I hear that in the newspapers, I do remember, and I'm like, oh my God, there are people dying. So apart from the occasional bursts of news that I hear, the war doesn't really affect me as I go about my day-to-day business on a personal level.
I was at work at UMass, and I walked into the secretary's office, and one of them said, I just heard that a plane hit one of the Twin Towers, the World Trade Center, and I was like, wow, and I assumed that it was a small private plane. And so I went back up to my office, and I called my wife and said, did you hear that a plane hit the towers? And she said, really? And she turned on the TV, and she said, it doesn't look like a small plane. And then, we hung up, and then she called back once the second plane hit the other tower.
I remember watching all the TV shows, all I wouldn't really call them commercials, but you see them on TV, you see the scenes, you see, I guess it was commercial advertising for the military, saying to stop this. Remember all the scenes of the buildings going up. I think I was in New York 2 weeks before that. My mom had just pointed out the Twin Towers, oh cool, you can see them right above everything. I went back a year later and they weren't there. It's just whoa, this actually happened. It actually affected it. It was weird. Coming just we're just here in Amherst, oh yeah, buildings crashed. Yeah, it was a hurricane in Japan. Yeah, it's but when you actually see it, strikes a lot more closer to home.
Well, in the moment, we were just told to be quiet and watch what was happening. And after the fact, I think my parents did try and explain to my sister and I what had happened, but I don't remember really comprehending it in the grand scheme of things. They told me that some people had crashed into the Twin Towers and that lots and lots of people had died, and that was obviously a very bad thing. But aside from the sadness of it, I don't think I understood the political implications or necessarily how 9/11 connected to the war that happened after.
My kids were, 5 and 7 years old. And actually, I came home from work once the first tower fell. I was on the phone with my wife, and she said the tower just fell. And I was like, what do you mean it fell? She's like, the whole thing just came down. And I was like, I'm coming home. And so I came home, and we watched it unfold, and the kids were in school. And so at one point, we just took a drive, and we said, what are we going to tell the kids?
Derek Shea, our counselor at that time, he later became a counselor at our high school, and then before he left, but he came running into our classroom and started like talking like frantically with my first grade teacher, and that's the first time I heard about it. They started telling the class that something had happened in New York City, and yeah, I don't really remember how it made me feel that much. I was in first grade, so I didn't understand really what was going on. I just remember being happy that the lesson ended, but
We said something bad happened today, something sad. And there were some people who had problems, some people who had who were unhappy or mad about certain things, and they hijacked a couple of planes and flew them into these skyscrapers in New York, and the buildings fell down. And I think the younger one said, something about maybe Batman should go get him or something, and the older one was sort of like, puzzled by it. But I think both of my kids were young enough that we said afterwards that if they'd been a year or two older, it would have been a lot harder to explain. I think it was just beyond their comprehension at that point. It was more like, oh, but then it just sort of went, past them. It was just too big to understand.
I don't think that I was old enough to really understand how big a deal 9/11 was, so I don't remember having a particularly strong emotional reaction, but I do remember my parents' reaction to it, and that really scared me. They thought it was a really big deal, as it was, obviously, and I remember them just being really sort of scared and angry at me and my sister for interrupting them as they were watching the attacks, and I remember that scaring me.
I think we worried that it was just going to be a big trauma that was going to be hard to, it'd be sort of a psychic wound that would be hard for people to overcome. But you're sort of in the moment, you're sort of in shock. And I think it was the kind of thing that, it was just so far out of anything that I'd seen before, or that I didn't have anything to compare it to, really.
It's not significant, but there's like, a thought in the back of my head, like there's always those people who don't like us. It's kind of weird. Like as a person, like I haven't done anything towards them, but they hate us as a whole. It's kind of weird. I mean, being Jewish, I get that, but see, there's also like when Bin Laden died. I remember everyone was so happy. And Ryan Diplock wore the American flag to school the next day. Nothing else. A little weird. But then I wrote in the Gazette. I wrote a letter to the editor about how we shouldn't be celebrating, and about how celebrate war. At least I don't feel that way. And a lot of people disagreed with me. It was weird. Like it was actually I got calls and I got emails from people who had read it that I didn't know. They were disagreeing with me, and I was like, "This is real."
Yeah.
I think that's the theme of what I'm saying. I didn't realize how real this is, but it's really, as I'm getting older, I'm seeing more and more of how actually unstable our world is.
Thanks to Graham and Laura for that bit of reporting. To find out how all these issues have affected our society, our laws, and our future, Josh and Student News executive producer Jesse Chasentabor sat down with Amherst College's Professor Austin Surratt and Lawrence Douglas. Take a look.
Well, I think it's both cause and effect a little bit. I mean, I think right after 9/11, 9/11 was obviously incredible trauma to the American psyche. And I think it's probably inevitable in light of that, a trauma like that you have an overreaction on the part of the government. So I'm no fan of the kind of policies that the Bush administration put into place, and I'm no fan of Dick Cheney. And that said, I think it is unmistakably the case that in the days after 9/11 and the months directly after 9/11, the members of that administration really were terrified that we were going to be hit again, and hit in a way that would have made 9/11 look even kind of small. So in certain ways, they had a tremendous amount of support on the part of the public because the public was terrified and they were terrified. Then later on, I do think you did find some pushback, that you found Americans kind of responding, going, well, maybe we need to be more vigilant in the protection of civil liberties, and maybe we've gone a little bit too far in erecting what looks a little bit more like a national security state.
And it isn't clear to me how much people are, to use your phrase, worried about terrorist attacks. Yes, public anxiety can be stoked when there is a report of a credible threat, no doubt about that. But I think we're living with, what might be described as the new normal. So you go into an airport and you're going to be searched, and you see police and TSA. I'm not sure that that frightens Americans anymore. It's just the new normal. You go into American cities and there are cameras filming you. I don't know that that stokes our fear. It's the new normal. So we're living under conditions which a decade ago many of us would have thought would be intolerable, but they're just now the new normal.
There have been things like the television show 24. 24 is something which I think, unfortunately, it also creates a perception among Americans that practices that I think most of us find pretty abhorrent, such as terror, that they torture, that practices such as torture actually can be efficacious. They can have a lot of utility in terms of helping the global fight against terror. I think if you actually look at the factual record, we find that enhanced interrogation techniques, torture, has had very, very little utility in making us more secure. And yet, unfortunately, I think there have been programs like 24, which actually kind of create this public perception that they are efficacious. And in ways, you find actually public opinion supporting practices that the government has actually even backed away from.
There's an effort in every American city and in airports to make us watchful, right? If something's unusual, report it. And I believe, and many, I think, would also believe that there's some edge of that that has a possibility of stoking a kind of intolerance. Intolerance towards Muslims, intolerance towards Arab Americans. And I think there's no doubt about that. But again, what I've described as the new normal is kind of just the way things are.
Yeah.
One of the things, there was a legal observer who wrote, when talking about this kind of balancing act between civil liberties versus national security, made, I thought, a very important observation. And his observation was, it's very easy to strike a balance between national security on the one hand and civil liberties on the other when it's our national security against their civil liberties. When it's not, when there are two separate groups involved.
I think if you look at national public opinion polls, you see that more and more Americans would say that it's time to get out of Afghanistan. But do you see organized demonstrations? Do you see marches on Washington? Do you see marches through downtown Amherst? You don't. So I would say that the attitude towards the war, and again here I'm talking about the war in Afghanistan, have shifted. They've shifted towards a position of people are impatient, they want it over. But the intensity of their views seems to me to be much less than were the intensity of views about Vietnam. So I think you need to look at two things. You need to look at sort of what is the overall direction of public opinion, but you also need to look at what I'm calling the intensity of the views that people hold.
I mean, I think in terms of, one of the things that would maybe less of a legal response and more of an economic response. I mean, I think the New York Times is talking about trying to calculate the overall cost of our response to the 9/11 attacks. And it's obviously very difficult to offer an exact dollar figure. And this is even bracketing all the deaths and war, the thousands of Americans have been killed, tens of thousands of people of other countries who have been killed as well. But the number they came up with was about $3.3 trillion. Now, some of that money you might say we're going to spend anyway in places like Afghanistan or something like that. Then you talk about the money that was spent in Iraq, which seemed like entirely discretionary war, or to call it something else, like an absolute catastrophe. And you look at the infrastructure in the United States, you look at the education system in the United States, you look at all these things. I mean, these are costs as well. They're called, like, I guess economists call these opportunity costs, that if you spend the money elsewhere, you're not spending it somewhere, spend the money in one place, you're not spending it elsewhere. And that itself is, I think, horrific. You know, I drive around Amherst and you got to negotiate your way through potholes because there's no money to repair the streets. So you have this decaying infrastructure in the United States. So I think that's one of the things that, you know, I hope we can get our priorities a little more in line in the coming decades so that we don't overspend in this kind of wild and profligate way. And then I suppose the other thing with respect to the legal challenges facing us is, you know, I do hope that, again, we find legal mechanisms that will put an end to practices like this indefinite detention of detainees, which just seems constitutionally unsustainable.
Much thanks to Professor Sarat and Professor Douglas for sitting down with Jesse and me. Now, in 2004, Osama bin Laden broadcast a speech directed at the American people. In it, he said that al-Qaeda could lead U.S. forces wherever they wished and force the United States to expend resources. Bin Laden went on to say, quote, "This is in addition to our having experience in using guerrilla warfare and the war of attrition to fight tyrannical superpowers, as we, alongside the Mujahideen, bled Russia for 10 years until it went bankrupt and was forced to withdraw in defeat. So we are continuing this policy in bleeding America to the point of bankruptcy." It goes without saying that Osama bin Laden and fanatical extreme fundamentalists like him breed a special kind of madness and evil in the world, a kind which you are required to have to kill 3,000 innocent civilians. That being said, bin Laden did often think in economic terms. On May 3rd, Ezra Klein wrote on his blog at the Washington Post, quote, "The campaign against the Soviet Union in the 1980s taught bin Laden a lot. For one thing, superpowers fall because their economies crumble, not because they're beaten on the battlefield. For another, superpowers are so allergic to losing that they'll bankrupt themselves trying to conquer a mass of rocks and sand. This was bin Laden's plan for the United States too. For bin Laden, in other words, success was not to be measured in body counts. It was to be measured in deficits, in borrowing costs, in investments we weren't able to make in our country's continued economic strength. And by those measures, bin Laden landed a lot of blows. The United States government is currently spending $9.7 billion in the two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We have erected new governments in those nations, and 10 years in, we still have troops on the ground in both countries, and we are still running drone strikes in Pakistan. And along with all of this, the U.S. currently has a $1.3 trillion budget deficit. In May, we killed Osama bin Laden, but yet still massive amounts of U.S. resources are being spent on Iraq and Afghanistan supporting U.S.-backed regimes, which is a risky move at best in light of the Middle East relationship with post-World War I colonialism. There will always be terrorists. There will always be people who hate the West, and we will always have to defend against possible terrorist attacks. However, there are issues to be dealt with at home, including education, infrastructure, and economic growth. We have all grown up or lived through a decade of war. In the next decade, let us move our focus and our money away from fighting terror and buying into the new normal, and instead direct our time and energy toward the United States acting as a member of a global community and toward strengthening our families, friends, country, and indeed all of humanity for the struggles that will face future generations.
That's it for us tonight. If you would like to learn more about the show and how to get involved, or to donate money, please visit our website at www.riverwolfproductions.org/studentnews. Until next time, I'm Giovanna Robinson-Heides.
Thanks to all of you for joining us, and I'm Joshua Wolfson. Stay strong and stay proud. Good night.